Hello Year 7s, welcome back. Hope you've had a lovely Easter and are ready to do some learning. We're going to be carrying on with wholes today. Remember, as well as these lessons that I'm posting on YouTube, there's read theory to do some reading in your own time. So that could be reading a book, reading a magazine, a newspaper, reading stuff on the internet. Find what you can, learn about what you can, do research about people that you find interesting. Anything at all is really going to help you. So before Easter, we got up to the part in wholes where we'd found out what had happened with Catherine Barlow. She started off in Green Lake as the school teacher. Things went wrong because Sam the onion picker kissed her, and after that the schoolhouse was burned down. She became a bit of a gangster, like a highway woman, and was known as Kissing Kate Barlow. And we know, excuse me, that in the end she was killed by the yellow spotted lizard when Trout Walker was trying to get her to dig to find out where she'd hidden all of her loot. So that gives us a clue as to actually where this story's going and why the boys at Camp Green Lake are having to dig all of the time. So we're going to carry on, and I've got a little bit of work to do at the end of today's reading. There was a change in the weather for the worse. The air became unbearably humid. Stanley was drenched in sweat. Beads of moisture ran down the handle of his shovel. It was almost as if the temperature had gotten so hot that the air itself was sweating. A loud boom of thunder echoed across the empty lake. A storm was way off to the west, beyond the mountains. Stanley could count more than 30 seconds between the flash of lightning and the clap of thunder. That was how far away the storm was. Sound travels a great distance across a barren wasteland. Usually Stanley couldn't see the mountains at this time of day. The only time they were visible was just at sunup, before the air became hazy. Now, however, the sky was very dark off to the west, and every time the lightning flashed, the dark shape of the mountains would briefly appear. "Come on, rain!" shouted Armpit. "Blow this way!" "Maybe it'll rain so hard it will fill up the whole lake," said Squid. "We can go swimming." 40 days and 40 nights, said X-Ray. "Guess we'd better start building us an ark. Get 2 of each animal, right?" "Right," said Zigzag. 2 rattlesnakes, 2 scorpions, 2 yellow spotted lizards. The humidity, or maybe the electricity in the air, had made Zigzag's head even more wild looking. His frizzy blonde hair stuck almost straight out. The horizon lit up with a huge web of lightning. In that split second, Stanley thought he saw an unusual rock formation on top of one of the mountain peaks. The peak looked to him exactly like a giant fist, with the thumb sticking straight up. Then it was gone, and Stanley wasn't sure whether he'd seen it or not. "I found refuge on God's thumb." That was what his great-grandfather had supposedly said after Kate Barlow had robbed him and left him stranded in the desert. No one ever knew what he meant by that. He was delirious when he'd said it. But how could he live for 3 weeks without food or water? Stanley had asked his father. "I don't know. I wasn't there," replied his father. "I wasn't born yet. My father wasn't born yet. My grandmother, your great-grandmother, was a nurse in the hospital where they treated him. He always talked about how she'd dab his forehead with a cool wet cloth. He said that's why he fell in love with her. He thought she was an angel." "A real angel?" His father didn't know. "What about after he got better? Did he ever say what he meant by God's thumb or how he survived?" "No, he just blamed his no-good pig-stealing father." The storm moved off farther west, along with any hope of rain, but the image of the fist and thumb remained in Stanley's head. Although instead of the lightning flashing behind the thumb, in Stanley's mind the lightning was coming out of the thumb, as if it were the thumb of God. The next day was Zigzag's birthday, or so he said. Zigzag lay in his cot as everyone headed outside. "I get to sleep in, because it's my birthday." Then a little while later, he cut into the breakfast line just in front of Squid. Squid told him to go to the end of the line. "Hey, it's my birthday," Zigzag said, staying where he was. "It's not your birthday," said Magna, who was standing behind Squid. "It's too," said Zigzag. "July the 8th. Stanley was behind Magnet. He didn't know what day of the week it was, let alone the date. It could have been July the 8th, but how would Zigzag know? He tried to figure out how long he'd been at Camp Green Lake, if indeed it was July the 8th. I came here on May the 24th, he said aloud, so that means I've been here 46 days, said Zero. Stanley was still trying to remember how many days there were in May and June. He looked at Zero. He'd learned not to doubt him when it came to math. 46 days felt more like 1,000. He didn't dig a hole the first day, and he hadn't dug one yet today. That meant he'd dug 44 holes, if it really was July the 8th. Can I have an extra carton of juice? Zigzag asked Mr. Sir. It's my birthday. To everyone's surprise, Mr. Sir gave it to him. Stanley dug his shovel into the dirt. Hole number 45. The 45th hole is the hardest, he said to himself. But that wasn't really true, and he knew it. He was a lot stronger than when he first arrived. His body had adjusted somewhat to the heat and harsh conditions. Mr. Sir was no longer depriving him of water. After having to get by on less water for a week or so, Stanley now felt like he had all the water he could want. Of course, it helped that Zero dug some of his hole for him each day, but that wasn't as great as everyone thought it was. He always felt awkward while Zero was digging his hole, unsure of what to do with himself. Usually he stood around a while before sitting off by himself on the hard ground, with the sun beating down on him. It was better than digging, but not a lot better. When the sun came up a couple of hours later, Stanley looked for the thumb of God. The mountains were little more than dark shadows on the horizon. He thought he could make out a spot where the top of one of the mountains seemed to jut upward, but it didn't seem very impressive. A short time later, the mountains were no longer visible, hidden behind the glare of the sun reflecting off the dirty air. It was possible, he realised, that he was somewhere near where Kate Barlow had robbed his great-grandfather. If that really was her lipstick tube he'd found, then she must have lived somewhere round here. Zero took his turn before lunch break. Stanley climbed out of his hole, and Zero climbed down into it. "Hey, caveman," said Zigzag, "you should get a whip. Then if your slave doesn't dig fast enough, you can crack it across his back." "He's not my slave," said Stanley. "We have a deal, that's all." "Good deal for you," said Zigzag. "It was Zero's idea, not mine." "Don't you know, Zig," said X-Ray, coming over, "Caveman's doing Zero a big favour. Zero likes to dig holes." "He sure is a nice guy to let Zero dig his hole for him," said Squid. "Well, what about me?" asked Armpit. "I like to dig holes too. Can I dig for you, Caveman, after Zero's finished?" The other boys laughed. "No, I want to," said Zigzag. "It's my birthday." Stanley tried his best to ignore them. Zigzag kept at it. "Come on, Caveman, be a pal, let me dig your hole." Stanley smiled as if it were all a big joke. When Mr. Pendanski arrived with water and lunch, Zigzag offered Stanley his place in line. "Since you're so much better than me." Stanley remained where he was. "I didn't say I was better." "You're insulting him, Zig," said X-Ray. "Why should Caveman take your place when he deserves to be at the very front? He's better than all of us, aren't you, Caveman?" "No," said Stanley. "Sure you are," said X-Ray. "Now come to the front of the line where you belong." "It's okay," said Stanley. "No, it's not okay," said X-Ray. "Get up here." Stanley hesitated, then moved to the front of the line. "Well, this is a first," Mr. Pendanski said, coming round to his side of the truck. He filled Stanley's canteen and handed him a sack lunch. Stanley was glad to get away. He sat down between his hole and Zero's. He was glad that he'd be digging his own hole for the rest of the day. Maybe the other boys would leave him alone. Maybe he shouldn't let Zero dig his hole for him any more, but he needed to save his energy to be a good teacher. He bit into the sandwich, which contained some kind of meat and cheese mixture that came in a can. Just about everything at Green Lake came in a can. The supply truck came once a month. He glanced up to see Zigzag and Squid walking toward him. "I'll give you my cookie if you let me dig your hole," said Zigzag. Squid laughed. "Here, take my cookie," said Zigzag, holding it out for him. "No thanks," said Stanley. "Come on, take my cookie," said Zigzag, sticking it in his face. "Leave me alone," said Stanley. "Please eat my cookie," said Zigzag, holding it under Stanley's nose. Squid laughed. Stanley pushed it away. Zigzag pushed him back. Don't push me. I didn't. Stanley got to his feet. He looked around. Mr. Penlansky was filling Zero's canteen. Zigzag pushed him again. I said, don't push me. Stanley took a step backward, carefully avoiding Zero's hole. Zigzag kept after him. He shoved Stanley and said, quit pushing. Lay off, said Armpit as he, Magnet and X-Ray joined them. Why should he? Snapped X-Ray. Caveman's bigger. He can take care of himself. I don't want any trouble, Stanley said. Zigzag pushed him hard. Eat my cookie, he said. Stanley was glad to see Mr. Penlansky coming toward them along with Zero. Hi, Mum, said Armpit. We're just fooling around. I saw what was going on, Mr. Penlansky said. He turned to Stanley. Go ahead, Stanley, he said. Hit him back. You're bigger. Stanley stared at Mr. Penlansky in astonishment. Teach the bully a lesson, said Mr. Penlansky. Zigzag hit Stanley on the shoulder with his open hand. Teach me a lesson, he challenged. Stanley made a feeble attempt to punch Zigzag. Then he felt a flurry of fists against his head and neck. Zigzag had hold of his collar with one hand and was hitting him with the other. The collar ripped and Stanley fell backward onto the dirt. That's enough, Mr. Penlansky yelled. It wasn't enough for Zigzag. He jumped on top of Stanley. Stop, shouted Mr. Penlansky. The side of Stanley's face was pressed against the dirt. He tried to protect himself, but Zigzag's fist slammed off his arms and pounded his face into the ground. All he could do was wait for it to be over. Then suddenly, Zigzag was off him. Stanley managed to look up, and he saw that Zero had his arm around Zigzag's long neck. Zigzag made a gagging sound as he desperately tried to pry Zero's arm off of him. You're going to kill him, shouted Mr. Penlansky. Zero kept squeezing. Armpit charged into them, freeing Zigzag from Zero's chokehold. The three boys fell to the ground in different directions. Mr. Penlansky fired his pistol into the air. The other councillors came running from the office, the tents or out on the lake. They had their guns drawn but holstered them when they saw the trouble was over. The warden walked over from her cabin. There was a riot, Mr. Penlansky told her. Zero almost strangled Ricky. The warden looked at Zigzag, who was still stretching and massaging his neck. Then she turned her attention to Stanley, who was obviously in the worst condition. What happened to you? Nothing. It wasn't a riot. Zigzag was beating up the caveman, said Armpit. Then Zero started choking Zigzag and I had to pull Zero off of Zigzag. It was all over before Mum fired his gun. They just got a little hot, that's all, said X-Ray. You know how it is, in the sun all day, people getting hot, right? But everything's cool now. I see, the warden said. She turned to Zigzag. What's the matter? Didn't you get a puppy for your birthday? Zig's just a little hot, said X-Ray. Out in the sun all day, you know how it is, the blood starts to boil. Is that what happens, Zigzag? Asked the warden. Yeah, said Zigzag. Like X-Ray said, working so hard in the hot sun while Caveman just sits around doing nothing. My blood boiled. Excuse me, said the warden. Caveman digs his holes just like everyone else. Zigzag shrugged. Sometimes. Excuse me? Zero's been digging part of Caveman's hole every day, said Squid. The warden looked from Squid to Stanley to Zero. I'm teaching him to read and write, said Stanley. It's sort of a trade. The hole still gets dug, so what does it matter who digs it? Excuse me, said the warden. Isn't it more important for him to learn to read? Stanley asked. Doesn't that build character more than digging holes? That's his character, said the warden. What about your character? Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. The warden turned to Zero. Well, Zero, what have you learned so far? Zero said nothing. Have you just been digging Caveman's hole for nothing? The warden asked him. He likes to dig holes, said Mr. Penlansky. Tell me what you learned yesterday, said the warden. Surely you can remember that. Zero said nothing. Mr. Penlansky laughed. He picked up a shovel and said, You might as well teach a shovel to read. It's got more brains than Zero. The at sound, said Zero. The at sound, repeated the warden. Well, tell me then, what does C-A-T spell? Zero glanced around uneasily. Stanley knew he knew the answer. Zero just didn't like answering questions. Cat, Zero said. Mr. Pendanski clapped his hands. Bravo, bravo, the boy's a genius. F-A-T, asked the warden. Zero thought for a moment. Stanley hadn't taught him the F sound yet. F, Zero whispered. F-A-T. Fat. How about H-A-T, asked the warden. Stanley hadn't taught him H sound either. Zero concentrated hard, then said, chat. All the councillors laughed. He's a genius, all right, said Mr. Pendanski. He's so stupid he doesn't even know he's stupid. Stanley didn't know why Mr. Pendanski seemed to have it in for Zero. If Mr. Pendanski only thought about it, he'd realise it was very logical for Zero to think that the H made the ch sound. OK, from now on I don't want anyone digging anyone else's hole, said the warden, and no more reading lessons. I'm not digging another hole, said Zero. Good, said the warden. She turned to Stanley. You know why you're digging holes? Because it's good for you. It teaches you a lesson. If Zero digs your hole for you, then you're not learning your lesson, are you? Guess not, Stanley mumbled, although he knew they weren't digging just to learn a lesson. She was looking for something that belonged to Kissing Kate Barlow. Why can't I dig my own hole but still teach Zero to read? He asked. What's wrong with that? I'll tell you what's wrong with that, the warden said. It leads to trouble. Zero almost killed Zigzag. It causes him stress, said Mr. Pendanski. I know you mean well, Stanley, but face it, Zero's too stupid to learn to read. That's what makes his blood boil, not the hot sun. I'm not digging another hole, said Zero. Mr. Pendanski handed him the shovel. Here, take it, Zero. It's all you'll ever be good for. Zero took the shovel. Then he swung it like a baseball bat. The metal blade smashed across Mr. Pendanski's face. His knees crumpled beneath him. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. The councillors all drew their guns. Zero held the shovel out in front of him, as if he were going to try and bat away the bullets. I hate digging holes, he said. Then he slowly backed away. Don't shoot him, said the warden. He can't go anywhere. The last thing we need is an investigation. Zero kept backing up, past the cluster of holes the boys had been digging, then farther and farther out onto the lake. He's going to have to come back for water, the warden said. Stanley noticed Zero's canteen lying on the ground near his hole. A couple of the councillors helped Mr. Pendanski to his feet and into the truck. Stanley looked out towards Zero, but he'd disappeared into the haze. The warden ordered the councillors to take turns guarding the shower room and rec room all day and all night. They were not to let Zero drink any water. When he returned, he was to be brought directly to her. She examined her fingernails and said, It's almost time for me to paint my nails again. Before she left, she told the 6 remaining members of Group D that she still expected 7 holes. Stanley angrily dug his shovel into the dirt. He was angry at everyone. Mr. Pendanski, the warden, Zigzag, X-Ray, and his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. But mostly he was angry at himself. He knew he should never have let Zero dig part of his hole for him. He could still have taught him to read. If Zero could dig all day and still have the strength to learn, then he should have been able to dig all day and still have the strength to teach. But what he should do, he thought, was go out after Zero. But he didn't. None of the others helped him dig Zero's hole, and he didn't expect them to. Zero had been helping him dig his hole. Now he had to dig Zero's. He remained out on the lake, digging during the hottest part of the day, long after everyone else had gone in. He kept an eye out for Zero, but Zero didn't come back. It would have been easy to go out after Zero. There was nobody to stop him. He kept thinking that's what he should do. Maybe they could climb to the top of Big Thumb, if it wasn't too far away, and if it really was the same place where his great-grandfather found refuge, and if, after 100 years or so, water was still there. It didn't seem likely, not when an entire lake had gone dry. And even if they did find refuge on Big Thumb, he thought, they'd still have to come back here eventually. Then they'd both have to face the warden and her rattlesnake fingers. Instead, he came up with a better idea, although he didn't quite have it all figured out yet. He thought that maybe he could make a deal with the warden. He'd tell her where he really found the gold tube if she wouldn't scratch Zero. He wasn't sure how he'd make this deal without getting himself in deeper trouble. She might just say, tell me where you found it or I'll scratch you too. Plus, that would mean X-Ray would get in trouble too. She'd probably scratch him up as well. X-Ray would be out to get him for the next 16 months. He dug his shovel into the dirt. By the next morning, Zero still hadn't returned. Stanley saw one of the councillors sitting guard by the water spigot outside the shower wall. Mr. Penlansky had 2 black eyes and a bandage over his nose. I always knew he was stupid, Stanley heard him say. Stanley was required to dig only 1 hole the next day. As he dug, he kept a constant watch out for Zero, but never saw him. Once again, he considered going out on the lake to look for him, but he began to realise that it was already too late. His only hope was that Zero had found God's thumb on his own. It wasn't impossible. His great-grandfather had found it. For some reason, his great-grandfather had felt the urge to climb to the top of that mountain. Maybe Zero would feel the same urge, if it was the same mountain, if water was still there. He tried to convince himself it wasn't impossible. There'd been a storm just a few days ago. Maybe Big Thumb was actually some kind of natural water tower that caught and stored the rain. It wasn't impossible. He returned to his tent to find the warden, Mr. Sir and Mr. Penlansky all waiting for him. Have you seen Zero? The warden asked him. No. Any sign of him at all? No. Do you have any idea where he went? No. You know, you're not doing him any favours if you're lying, said Mr. Sir. He can't survive out there for more than a day or 2. I don't know where he is. All 3 stared at Stanley, as if they were trying to figure out if he was telling the truth. Mr. Penlansky's face was so swollen he could barely open his eyes. They were just slits. You sure he has no family? The warden asked Mr. Penlansky. He's a ward of the state, Mr. Penlansky told her. He was living on the streets when he was arrested. Is there anyone who might ask questions? Some social worker who took an interest in him? He had nobody, said Mr. Penlansky. He was nobody. The warden thought for a moment. OK, I want you to destroy all of his records. Mr. Penlansky nodded. He was never here, said the warden. Mr. Sir nodded. Can you get into the state files from our computer? She asked Mr. Penlansky. I don't want anyone in the AG's office to know he was here. I don't think I can erase him completely from all state files, said Mr. Penlansky. Too many cross-references, but I can make it so it would be very difficult for anyone to ever find a record of him. Like I said though, no one will ever look. No one cares about Hector Zeroni. Good, said the warden. So, Zero seems to be in a bit of an impossible position here. He's hit Mr. Penlansky with a shovel. He's ran off across the lake. We know that there's no water, or Stanley was told when he first arrived at Camp Green Lake that there's no water for 100 miles. But Stanley does know about this mountain that his great-grandfather called God's Thumb, where he survived for three weeks without any water. Perhaps it's the same mountain that he saw during the thunderstorm. What I'd like you to think about is if you were to meet Zero now, what advice would you give him? What should he do? How can he get himself out of this seemingly impossible position? You can write it down, you can have a think about it, you can talk to somebody about it, and we'll come back to the story next week.